Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my co-host on this program is the one and only Alan Reinach, who is the president of the Church State Council, and we are trying to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. And the topic today, Alan, talk about political extremes. We're talking about the whole COVID era, which most of us would like to just blank out of our collective memories. But we're talking about COVID vaccines and requests for exemptions from mandates based on religious beliefs. It's going to be an interesting interview.
Well, I get the honors at introducing our guest today because our guest is none other than Jonathan Cherne, my partner in legal crime, so to speak. Jonathan and I have been litigating employment discrimination cases for people of faith for, a dozen years now, it seems.
A little longer. I think that Baker's dozen, I think.
A baker's dozen. And I have to say, Jonathan has become a very fine employment law attorney and a blessing to have as a partner. And our discussion today is going to be about kind of the big bubble that we've had in religious discrimination cases, which has to do with the many hundreds and thousands of Americans who lost their jobs because of religious objections to the COVID-19 vaccines. And our point here is not to be, culture warriors and attacking vaccines or vaccine mandates or what have you, but looking at the interesting issues for those who did have religious objections to the vaccines.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Alan, it's not a good recommendation when you say Jonathan is your partner in crime. I just wanted to point that out. And, the issue of COVID vaccines and COVID in general, I mean, it came out of nowhere and it just whacked us over the head, right? It was just, a moment in time which no one could have seen coming. And in many ways, it presented just a real stress test to the American legal system. So as attorneys dealing in religious liberty issues, how would you say that the legal system fared when it came to the stress that was placed on it with COVID?
Is that for me?
So, you know what? I sort of almost feel like I'm the one doing the interviewing of both of you in this show. Even though, Alan, you're still my co-host, you can still ask questions. But both of you were involved in this and still are litigating these cases. So, yeah, the question's for both of you, really. But Jonathan, start out.
Sure. Yeah, I think the judicial system was kind of caught by surprise. I mean, they definitely weren't prepared for it. We had, pretty much every case's uh, calendars got set aside. The courts were shut down. Most courts didn't have really the ability for remote appearances yet. And so, I mean, my practice, doing employment law, religious discrimination work, kind of came to a standstill for a while. Employers weren't willing to engage in settlement talks because, there's no reason for them to put money on the table when they could, keep that money in their pocket a little longer. And so, things really slowed down from that perspective. But, I do or did estate planning on the side, and that really picked up. A lot of people thinking they were going to die called me, and so that actually picked up during COVID. So it was kind of interesting.
Huh. I mean, was it your experience too, Alan? Not with the estate planning.
Well, to be more specific, when it comes to the COVID litigation itself, I have been telling our clients for some time that time is our friend because in we were not involved in the early challenges to the mandates themselves, just so we're clear, because that was the first round of cases where a lot of the challenges to church closings, challenges to the mandates, and some of those cases went to the Supreme Court. But when it came to individuals who lost their jobs, my feeling was, and I think it's been borne out by the cases, that early on there was still so much fear, pandemic-related fear driving things that they were pandemic cases, and that over time they would become religious discrimination, religious accommodation cases, and the courts would, in a more sort of objective manner, start thinking through, well, how do the legal protections pertain in this fact pattern rather than simply being driven by fear. And I think the biggest surprise that I've had when I started lecturing, I don't know, 2021, when the vaccines had come out, um, I would say to lawyers, I don't see much light in representing folks in healthcare because in healthcare, I don't see judges willing to second guess hospital administration when it comes to making decisions to protect, immunocompromised patients. And what turned me around on that was the fact that very large hospital systems, not just in red states, but here in California, were accommodating thousands of nurses and doctors and allowing them to work unvaccinated with their patients. So it's like, oh, well, if they don't see a problem with having unvaccinated people work with their patients, I guess they can accommodate those with religious objections. So
Uh,
that really changed my thinking on that.
You know, you're describing a time that was really unsettled, a lot of unknowns, a lot of fear. But let's back up a little bit and talk more specifically about the legal issues involved in making a religious liberty claim, a religious freedom claim around vaccines. So, Jonathan, tell us what the law is regarding religious freedom and one's ability to refuse a vaccine mandate.
yeah, so currently, under federal law, there's Title VII, which requires an employer to accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practice unless it would create an undue hardship. The court has created a burden shifting test called the McDonnell Douglas test that actually Alan and I are challenging at the Supreme Court right now. So we'll see if that continues to be the test. But so with that test, you have to have a sincere religious belief. You have to, provide notice, and that notice requirement actually has been held, kind of whether it is required or not in the Abercrombie case. So, some courts are still applying a notice requirement, others aren't. But then there has to be some sort of adverse action, something that happened. And then the burden would shift to the employer to prove that they either offered a reasonable accommodation or that it would suffer an undue hardship in accommodating. And um, and then at that point, it kind of shifts back to the employee to show that no, what the employer said was all pretextual and, really they were discriminating against me and they could have accommodated me.
So let's zero in then on the religious belief component, because it seemed to me that a lot of the controversy that we saw being generated by COVID-19 vaccines and claimed exemptions zeroed in on this religious belief. What type of religious belief is legally acceptable? If you understand what I'm trying to say,
Sure.
what sort of religious belief do you have to assert?
Yeah, it was actually very interesting because, like Alan said, we've been doing this 12, 13 years, and pretty much all of our cases were litigated over whether this was an undue hardship to accommodate our client. There wasn't a whole lot of questioning of our clients' religious beliefs. We
Mm.
did have one case where a client was claiming a, you know, religious observance of the Sabbath belief. And so we took that case and during discovery found a bunch of emails where they were volunteering to work overtime shifts on Saturdays, on their Sabbath. So that case, did revolve around the sincerity of their religious belief. But for most of the cases up until COVID, it was really, would accommodating, this individual, their religious belief or practice be a hardship, an undue hardship on the business. And so COVID was kind of a shift where now employers started scrutinizing, okay, what are these religious beliefs? Are we going to recognize them as religious beliefs? And we've seen employers, you know, someone could just say they had a religious belief and didn't have to put what it was, and it would be accepted, up to, employers saying we're not accepting any religious beliefs, or any um, religious exemptions. And so it really depended on the employer and what they thought about, you know, a religious exemption and different religious beliefs. Some, had certain beliefs that they would accept and others they would not. Some employers had requirements that if your church, has an objection to vaccines in general, then we'll accept it. If it doesn't, then we won't. And so you really saw this like spray of different ideas from employers that we've been kind of working through. And it's interesting, a lot of the appellate court decisions have kind of worked through a lot of those issues as well. And I think it's really strengthened religious liberty and religious discrimination claims by, getting these favorable circuit court opinions that kind of define what an employee has to show, and what the employer's obligation is, how much can they question an employee's religious beliefs.
So, Alan, I mean, does that accord really with your experience also? I mean, my understanding was that you have to have a sincere religious belief. It doesn't necessarily have to reflect an institutional belief of the denomination to which you belong. So, those employers who, as Jonathan has said, were kind of requiring you to prove that your church held this belief, they were actually legally in the wrong. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's been well established going back, at least about 4 decades, that what the First Amendment protects is your own belief, whether or not it's something taught by your church. So one of the early cases involved a Jehovah Witness who was working for a steel company, and he was fine producing steel, but when they changed production and it was all going for military production, he had a conscientious objection based on his faith to participating in military production. And so he quit. And the question was, whether that was a legitimate exercise, whether his religious freedom was protected in that context such that he'd be entitled to unemployment benefits. And the court said, yes, your uh, your religious faith is your own. It's not just what the church says. Now we've seen
The lower
im-
court, though, the lower court said he had a buddy that was of the same faith that was willing to work in the side of the business that actually made the gun turrets or whatever. And so the lower court found, well, look, your buddy's willing to, so this isn't a sincere religious belief of your religion. And so, he appealed that, and the court in that case, it went up to the Supreme Court, and he was like, look, it doesn't matter if everyone else in that religious faith believes differently. If this is this person's religious belief, it should be accommodated short of undue hardship.
my very first Sabbath case back in New York, back in the early 90s, was a lady who was hired by the Transportation Authority as a bus driver. And when she asked for Sabbath accommodation, what was she told? We have lots of Seventh-day Adventists working for us, and they don't have a problem with driving their bus on Sabbath. What's your problem? You know? So yeah, we've seen that before. We have at least one case right now where I don't think we filed this one yet, where the employer said, "Well, you say you're Catholic, and your objection is based on the connection between these vaccines and aborted fetal cell lines, but the Pope says it's fine. You should take the vaccine. So, you can't have a sincere religious belief. Your objection is personal."
Hmm.
Right.
And of course, that's not kosher, shall we say.
Okay, so here's my question then. How does one establish a sincere religious belief for legal purposes? Because, there was a great deal of skepticism during COVID and as the initial mandates came in that some of these purported claims of religious beliefs were pretext for other objections to the vaccine, and it was a very toxic time and a toxic discussion. And so this issue of sincerity became sort of like the pivot point of this whole discussion. Are these people who are claiming these exemptions sincere? So how do you as attorneys screen your potential clients for sincerity, for instance?
I think there's two things. One is sincerity, and one is religious belief. They could be sincere about it, but maybe it's it's scientific or political belief, but they're still sincere about it.
Okay.
As far as religious beliefs, there's a great case out of the Ninth Circuit called Heller, and they said that all that's required is just enough information about the employee's religious need to permit the employer to understand the existence of a conflict between the employee's religious belief and the job requirement. So you don't have to give a, you know, two-page theological explanation. You just have to give enough information to show the existence of a conflict between the employee's religious practice and the employer's job requirements. And there's actually been a few, I know of at least one case recently where the employee requested a religious accommodation to the COVID vaccine based on their objection to abortion and the use of fetal cell lines in the manufacture and testing of the vaccines. And so the employer sent all these additional questions asking about, whether they've taken these drugs and these other drugs in the past that have also been tested. And the employee in that case, wrote on their, medical privacy, I don't feel comfortable answering these questions. And they were denied a accommodation and terminated, and they filed a lawsuit, and the judge actually granted summary judgment to the employee, saying that they had submitted enough information showing there was a conflict between the two. And so, with the case law, I think it's pretty clear that you don't have to give a whole lot unless, like in my one case where the employee was volunteering to work on Sabbath, and there's actually a question about the sincerity, or if it's some belief that clearly isn't religious, you know, an employee should not have to go through, you know, a interrogation into their religious beliefs.
So it's not the place of the court to become a theological expert, right? And so, you know, if you are asserting a religious belief, it should on its face be sufficient, correct?
It should be, but this is where the employers have really gotten sideways from the law because they have been assuming, basically, they've been taking a hostile view of accommodation requests. Now, you asked, how do we determine, how do we as lawyers decide which cases to take? And if you ask my staff, but we've had hundreds and hundreds of requests for help. And many people who come to us, they did not have they had sincere objections to the vaccine, but they weren't religious. And the short answer is you can't really tell unless you talk with somebody. But a lot of these employers were unwilling to talk with individuals, and they're judging people's sincerity on the basis of what they write on a piece of paper. And it wasn't even clear to people what they were supposed to write, except that I have a religious objection to the vaccine. And of course, we have a multi-ethnic society. English is not the first language for everybody. And the whole system of trying to weed out the alleged, fraudulent requests was itself fraudulent.
And most people aren't, you know, um, educated in their religion to the extent where they could write, some very extensive understanding of the theological reasons for why they're making their decision. And so I think it's wrong to question people, especially those who are, less educated, so that otherwise it's just exemptions for the educated or exemptions for those
Mhm.
with theological training,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
isn't a limitation in our Constitution.
I guess
It-
what made this whole situation more complicated is that most denominations were quite clear that they did not hold theological positions that would sustain or support someone's vaccine hesitancy, for instance. Like the Pope very early on issued a statement saying, taking the vaccine is a way to be a good neighbor, and sort of basically said, you don't need to worry about the aborted stem cell lines and so on. The church that I represent, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, also, put out a statement saying, this is not part of our theological beliefs that we would encourage someone to refuse a vaccine. Most other denominations followed suit. That was a complicating factor here, right?
I think to some extent, um, it was complicated in that it was misunderstood. I had, for different clients, I was helping through the exemption process. Their HR directors of the companies would email me the church's statement on vaccines, but those legally didn't matter. Uh, regarding whether my client had a sincere religious belief or not. But I mean, with vaccines, it's not really um, the type of decision that I think a corporate church body should make. It's more of an individualized decision. It's kind of like, there's individuals who are convicted on certain dresses, certain dress attire. And whether you're talking about the Muslim world or even Adventists, there's Adventists that, females that I know that, wear skirts because it's a religious conviction. The church, though, doesn't have a stance on that, and it's not really the type of thing. There's not like a black letter rule in the Christian religious text, the Bible, of one way or the other. But some individuals are following their conviction one way and some another way, and so I think it's just important to recognize that different people can be convicted by God different ways for the same thing, and I think you see that in the Bible as well, where, different people were told to do the exact opposite thing at the same time. And for both of them, that was the right thing. And so just recognizing that every individual has their personal relationship with God if they so choose. And it's important that each person be allowed to follow, that conviction, based on that relationship.
So let me put this in a larger context for a minute, Bettina, because back in 1990, the very conservative Roman Catholic Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, um, you know, wrote the opinion in a case called Employment Division against Smith, and he really negated broad free exercise protection for individual rights of conscience. And he expressed concern that every conscience become a law unto itself. And because of that concern, we had the complete erosion of free exercise. Now, that was 1990. Fast forward, we're what, 30, almost 35 years later, and that philosophy has really taken a hit, and the Supreme Court is looking for ways to revisit that and revise it. But in the COVID context, um, what the courts sometimes fail to understand is the essence of Protestantism. The just shall live by faith. That if we pray to God and we feel guided by the Holy Spirit to do or to refrain from doing something, that this is the exercise of religion and that we have a legal right to obey God according to the dictates of conscience. Um, Employers certainly had no education, no training, no way to evaluate any of this, and they made lots and lots of mistakes, and thousands of Americans have lost jobs and suffered as a result.
And
Um,
here's another issue with that. Scalia was very much of this mindset that if religious minorities needed exemptions from generally applicable laws, they needed to seek them through the legislatures. They need to use the democratic process to get those exemptions. And he was expressing that as a conservative Catholic. He was um, he didn't foresee, I guess, the culture wars of today, where it is the progressive left who see exemptions, legal exemptions, as something that are invalid and that should not be granted. And so this whole discussion of COVID vaccine exemptions is caught up in this bigger issue of religious exemptions generally, because as you know, exemptions to laws on the basis of religion, they're just in bad odor with the political progressives these days. So did that aspect make your work, and is it making your work more complicated in relation to the COVID vaccine issue?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, the judicial system's supposed to not be, political, but, it really, from what I've seen, it's kind of come down to who is your judge and, what are their thoughts about, you know, COVID and the vaccines and all. As far as at the district court level, that's kind of what I've seen. In fact, we had a case where Um, the judge we filed the complaint, and the judge had issued a tentative ruling throwing out the case, saying, that, it's undue hardship and, we're not even gonna let it proceed to the discovery phase. And thankfully, the case was consolidated with other cases before the tentative ruling got issued, and we got another judge where they filed the same sort of motion in the consolidated cases that denied it and said, no, we need to do discovery to determine if there's really an undue hardship and all on the employer. So, it kind of depends on the judicial or political leanings of the judge. I don't know. Is that kind of what you're seeing, Alan?
Well, I do want to point out, and I see we're kind of out of time here, that in the only a couple of jury verdicts that we have seen so far, there was a case against Bay Area Rapid Transit in California, which, according to the lawyers who tried the case, the jury was dead set against them from the beginning, very pro-vaccine jury, and yet they wound up awarding $7.8 million for 6 individuals, bus drivers or mechanics or what have you, for BART. And, they were turned around by the facts. So, yeah, we've certainly seen judges who are dead set against our clients' interests. But so far, so good.
Yeah. I guess this is part of an ongoing discussion that we'll continue to have, not just in relation to COVID vaccines, but to other issues of legal exemptions on the basis of religious belief. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with us today. Really appreciate you and the work that you do. And, Ellen, I feel like you're a guest today. I feel like I should thank you too.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a good
Thank you
discussion.
for having me too. This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach with Bettina Krause. Until next time, do remember, eternal vigilance is still the price of liberty.